The first crack in the foundation of my life didn't announce itself with a roar, but with a whisper. It was the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind my husband Marcus, leaving me in the humming silence of our home. A single venomous thought bloomed in that quiet, a weed in the manicured garden of our 15-year marriage. I hope he's gone for a long time. The thought was so sharp, so treasonous, it stole the air from my lungs. I sank against the doorframe, the cool wood a stark contrast to the sudden heat flushing my skin. Outside, the perpetual autumn drizzle of Astoria, Oregon, had begun, blurring the world into a watercolor of gray and green. Marcus had just orchestrated another of his elaborate casual get-togethers, this one a celebration of a promotion I couldn't even recall the title of. Our sprawling craftsman home, usually a sanctuary of quiet sea-misted light, was now a war zone of greasy plates, half-empty wine bottles, and the lingering ghost of charred salmon. He and his colleagues, triumphant and loud, had migrated to a downtown pub to continue their revelry, leaving me, the silent partner in his success, to manage the fallout. I had waved him off with a practiced, weary smile, my mind already cataloging the hours of scrubbing that lay ahead. I was turning toward the kitchen, a sigh already forming on my lips, when a figure materialized in the arched doorway. It was Liam. He was one of Marcus's newer associates, a transplant from somewhere back east. He held a black trash bag open like an offering. "Looks like you could use a tactical unit," he said, his voice a low, calm counterpoint to the chaotic scene. A faint, almost apologetic smile touched his lips. I was startled. Liam was a constant yet peripheral presence at these functions. Unlike Marcus's other friends, boisterous, back-slapping men who seemed to compete for airspace, Liam was an observer. He had this unsettling stillness about him, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, deep gray with flecks of silver that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. You always had the feeling he was processing the world on a different frequency. "Liam, you absolutely don't have to," I insisted, gesturing vaguely at the disaster. "This is part of the hostess package." He shrugged, the movement easy and unhurried. He tied off the bag with a deft twist of his wrist. "I've got nothing but time. Besides, the commanding officer should never have to clean the battlefield alone." I was too exhausted to protest further. There was also a strange, unexpected comfort in his offer, in not having to face the wreckage in solitude. So, we began. An unspoken rhythm quickly established itself between us. He started in the kitchen, a methodical and surprisingly graceful presence amidst the clutter, while I tackled the living room. The only sounds were the clinking of glasses, the rustle of trash bags, and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn out on the Columbia River. We moved around each other with an eerie, fluid grace, as if we'd done this a dozen times before. I watched from the corner of my eye as he tackled the monstrous cast-iron skillet Marcus had left soaking in the sink, scrubbing away the blackened remnants of dinner with a focused intensity. Most men I knew would have declared it a lost cause. He seemed to notice my gaze and glanced over his shoulder. "Does he ever actually cook?" Liam asked, his voice laced with a dry humor, "or just create culinary crime scenes?" A genuine laugh escaped me, raw and real. If he could outsource breathing, he would. Liam's chuckle was a low rumble. "I get that." For a fleeting moment, the professional mask he wore seemed to slip, revealing a flicker of something deeply knowing, something that suggested he understood the architecture of my life far better than a casual acquaintance should. As we worked, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It wasn't a sudden change, nothing you could pinpoint, but a slow-building current of awareness. I became conscious of the way Liam's dark flannel sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms dusted with fine dark hair. I noticed the deliberate, precise way his hands moved, sorting glass from plastic, wiping down a sticky countertop. He, in turn, seemed to notice the unconscious way I kneaded the tense muscles in my neck. "You should sit down for a minute, Alara," he said softly, his voice cutting through my tired haze. "You look like you're about to fold." He was drying his hands on a dish towel, and his gaze was direct, yet gentle. "I'm fine," I lied, the word automatic on my tongue. "No, you're not," he countered, just as softly. "But you're very good at pretending you are." His observation struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so true, and so utterly unexpected. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, my knees suddenly weak. He poured a glass of water and set it in front of me, his fingers brushing mine as I reached for it. A jolt, like a low-voltage current, shot up my arm. We both flinched, a barely perceptible recoil, and our eyes met. In that split second, the air crackled. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with a fragile, terrifying recognition. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "You really should go, Liam. I can handle the rest." He didn't move. He leaned against the counter opposite me, crossing his arms. "Why do I get the feeling you've been handling the rest by yourself for a very long time?" I was acutely aware of everything suddenly. The loose thread on the cuff of my sweater, the faint scent of rain and pine that clung to him, the profound exhaustion that was more than just physical. It was a soul-deep weariness from years of shrinking myself to fit into the spaces Marcus left for me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate in the cavernous kitchen. I managed a nod, though it felt like a lie. "Just tired." "Do you ever feel tired, but you can't remember why?" "All the time," he confessed, and his admission was a balm. It's the curse of people who notice things. A strange, breathless laugh escaped me. It wasn't born of humor, but of relief. The profound, earth-shattering relief of being seen. He gestured to the worn armchair in the corner of the kitchen, the one I used for reading. "Sit, for real this time." "I won't let the house burn down." I hesitated, then obeyed, sinking into the familiar cushions. He didn't join me, just went back to quietly cleaning. But his presence was a tangible comfort. The silence that fell wasn't empty. It was companionable. "You and Marcus," he said after a long while, his back still to me. He chose his words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "You seem like a solid team." "We're comfortable," I replied, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth. "We've perfected the routine." "Routine isn't the same as connection," he murmured, almost to himself. And just like that, another wall crumbled inside me. I don't know what prompted my next question. Maybe it was the third glass of wine I'd had at the party, or the mesmerizing rhythm of the rain against the window panes, or the astonishing, unnerving feeling of being truly perceived. "Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "why did you really stay?" He stopped what he was doing and turned to face me fully. His sea-gray eyes held mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of a deep, ancient sadness in them, a sorrow that recognized my own. "Because," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name, "you looked like you were drowning, and nobody else seemed to notice." We didn't speak again after that. He finished the last of the dishes, wiped down the counters until they gleamed, and gathered the final bag of trash. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, he paused. He reached out, not to touch me, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed my temple, a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it set my entire nervous system on fire. He let his hand linger for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of the charge that pulsed between us. I should have pulled back. I should have created distance. I didn't. "Good night, Ilara," he said, his voice a quiet caress. The way he said my name, as if it were a precious, forgotten thing, cracked something open deep inside me, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a study in cognitive dissonance. I moved through my life with a practiced normalcy, but my internal landscape had been irrevocably altered. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence, my mind a constant loop of replays, the brush of Liam's hand, the unnerving insight in his stormy eyes, the resonant timbre of his voice. A low, persistent hum had started under my skin, a frequency I'd never felt before, or perhaps one I had spent years deliberately ignoring. Marcus returned from his work trip a few days later, full of stories of spreadsheets and client dinners. He kissed my cheek with the absent-minded affection of a man kissing a photograph. I smiled my usual smile, played my usual role, but as I lay beside him in the dark expanse of our bed that night, his familiar snores filling the silence, my thoughts were of another man. I was consumed by the memory of what hadn't happened, the kiss that wasn't taken, the words that weren't said. An emotional affair, I realized, doesn't begin with a touch. It begins with a feeling of being truly seen. 4 days after the party, a text message lit up my phone. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew instantly who it was. Hope I didn't overstep the other night. It was good to talk to someone who speaks the same language. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was such a simple, innocuous message, but it felt like a secret key turning in a lock I'd forgotten existed. I stared at it for a long, long time. "Not at all," I finally typed back, my fingers trembling slightly. It was nice having an ally on the battlefield. The 3 dots that appeared on the screen felt like an eternity. Then his reply. "I notice a lot more than just the mess, Alara." My breath hitched, and there it was again. That vertiginous sensation of standing on the precipice of something vast and unknown, something that could either shatter me or resurrect me. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I placed my phone face down on the granite countertop and pressed my palms against the cool stone, trying to ground myself. That evening, I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and pretended to watch a documentary with Marcus. He was oblivious, lost in his own world of deadlines and ambitions. But I was no longer there with him. I was adrift in a sea of what-ifs, my mind filled with the image of soft, stormy eyes and the weight of a silence that felt more fulfilling than any conversation I'd had in years. The next time I saw him was a week later. I told myself it was a coincidence. Marcus had roped him into helping fix a section of fence that had been damaged in a winter storm. I saw him from the kitchen window, his back to the house, his posture relaxed as he laughed at something Marcus said. He was wearing a faded denim shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hair tousled by the sea breeze. He looked rugged and real, a stark contrast to the polished corporate version of himself I was used to. As if sensing my gaze, he looked up, and his eyes met mine through the glass. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, and I felt my cheeks flush. Later, I brought them lemonade on the deck. It was the polite, wifely thing to do. As I handed Liam his glass, our fingers deliberately brushed. It wasn't an accident this time. It was a question. His gaze held mine, steady and searching, for a beat longer than was socially acceptable. "Thanks, Alara," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me. Marcus, oblivious, stretched and groaned. "All right, break's over. This thing won't build itself." Liam held my gaze for one more charged second before turning to follow my husband back to the yard. That evening, long after the tools were put away and Marcus was asleep in his armchair, the sound of the television a dull drone, my phone buzzed. "You looked beautiful today, even with that smudge of flour on your cheek." Flour. I touched my cheek, my mind reeling. I had been stress baking a loaf of bread earlier, a frantic, mindless activity to keep my hands busy. He had noticed. Of course he had. He noticed everything. I stared at the message, a war raging within me. Every fiber of my being yearned to lean into the warmth of his words, to confess how they had landed in the barren, neglected soil of my soul and taken root. But a wave of guilt washed over me, not the guilt of betrayal, for nothing had truly happened, but the aching, insidious guilt of knowing my heart had already strayed, wandering into territories it had no right to explore. Over the next few weeks, our messages became a lifeline. They were careful, infrequent, never crossing a definitive line, yet they were imbued with a weight and intimacy that our real-life interactions couldn't allow. He spoke of books he was reading, of the haunting beauty of the coastal fog, of his own quiet struggles with feeling like an outsider. He asked me about my dreams, the ones I had before I became Mrs. Marcus Thorne. He was excavating the woman I used to be, layer by painful layer. The inevitable finally happened when Marcus took a weekend trip to a conference in Seattle. The house, without his boisterous presence, felt cavernous, its silence amplifying my own loneliness. I wandered from room to room, a restless spirit in my own home, touching objects as if to remind myself they were real. A framed photo of Marcus and me on our honeymoon, our smiles stiff and posed. The worn arm of his leather chair. The silence was unbearable. On impulse, I picked up my phone. The house is too quiet. His reply was almost instantaneous. Want some company? My heart stuttered. Yes, I typed, and deleted it. Maybe, I typed, and deleted that too. After a long, agonizing pause, I sent a single word. Okay. 20 minutes later, he was at my door. He didn't step inside immediately but stood on the porch, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression unreadable in the dim twilight. He was waiting for my permission, a gesture of respect so profound it almost brought me to tears. I stepped aside, and he entered, bringing the scent of the damp evening air with him. We sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, the space between us humming with a palpable energy. We talked about everything and nothing, old movies, frustrating jobs, childhood memories, but beneath the surface of the mundane conversation, a deeper truth was being communicated. I'm not trying to complicate your life, Ilara, he said suddenly, his voice soft but firm. His gaze was so direct it felt like a physical touch. I like being around you. You feel real. I swallowed against the lump forming in my throat. I don't remember the last time anyone said that to me. He reached across the small table and gently brushed his knuckles against the back of my hand. The touch was feather light, a question, not a demand. My fingers instinctively curled, not away from his, but towards it. I don't know what this is, I whispered, the words trembling. You don't have to, he said. We don't have to name it. We just have to be honest about it. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, our hands barely touching, our breaths held, our hearts exposed and vulnerable in the quiet intimacy of the kitchen. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't try to kiss me. He didn't pull me into an embrace. He simply squeezed my hand, a brief, warm pressure that conveyed more than 1,000 passionate gestures ever could. Good night, Ilara. When he was gone, I didn't feel guilty. I felt terrifyingly, incandescently alive. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I could never go back to being asleep. The next morning, I woke before the dawn. The sheets beside me were cold. The house was wrapped in a reverent stillness. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dark window, and wondered when the rules of my own life had been rewritten. There had been no sordid affair, no physical betrayal, but a quiet, seismic shift had occurred. A single thread had come loose in the tapestry of my marriage, and in pulling it, I risked unraveling everything. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Thinking of you. Hope today is kind to you. The message was a simple act of tenderness, yet it pierced the morning quiet like a shard of light. I went out to my small, overgrown garden, a space Marcus rarely entered. It was my sanctuary. Sitting on the cold, damp bench, I finally replied, "Thinking of you, too. I wish I understood what was happening." His response was immediate. "Maybe you don't need to understand it. Maybe you just need to let it be." And somehow that gave me permission to breathe. It wasn't about choosing between two men. It was never about that. It was about the chasm that had opened between feeling invisible and feeling seen. A week later, I saw him at the local hardware store. We passed in the paint aisle, the air thick with the chemical scent of possibility. The look he gave me, soft, open, achingly familiar, made my heart clench. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low. "This isn't the place," I whispered, glancing around nervously. A slow smile touched his lips. "Then let's find one that is a walk, somewhere quiet, no expectations." I looked into his stormy eyes, into the reflection of a woman I was only just beginning to recognize as myself, and I nodded. We met at a secluded walking trail just outside of town, where ancient pines leaned over the path like silent, benevolent giants. He was waiting by his truck, and when he saw me, he didn't smile. He just watched me approach, his expression one of solemn gravity. "Are you sure about this, Alara?" he asked as I drew near. "No," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. "But I'm here." "That's enough," he said. We walked in a comfortable silence at first, the crunch of gravel under our feet the only sound. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. And it was a silence that didn't need to be filled, a space where I felt I could finally just be. "I don't know what I'm doing," I confessed, the words tumbling out. "Marcus and I, we're not a team. We're just two people who share a mortgage and a history. I didn't realize how empty I was until you looked at me and saw something was there." He stopped and turned to face me. "I see you, Alara," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I see all of you." Tears I hadn't realized I was holding back burned behind my eyes. "I can't make you any promises, Liam. I can't just detonate my life." "I'm not asking you to," he said, his voice impossibly gentle. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a warm, solid anchor in my swirling sea of confusion. "I don't want to be a secret, but I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm willing to wait. I'll wait until you figure out what you want, or until you tell me to go." I looked at our joined hands, at this man who asked for nothing but offered everything. "I need time," I whispered. "Then take it," he said. "All the time you need." That night, I didn't write in my journal. I sat down at the dining room table, across from Marcus. For the first time in years, I turned off the television. I turned off the noise, and I started to talk. I told him the truth, not the whole truth about Liam, but the more important truth about us, about the silence, the distance, the slow, imperceptible drift into becoming polite, respectful strangers. There were no fireworks. There was no shouting. There was only a profound, heartbreaking sadness as we both admitted what we had known for years. The love had faded. All that was left was the habit of being married. It was a slow, painful conversation, but it was honest. And in that honesty, there was a strange, clean kind of relief. We agreed to separate, kindly, carefully. Months later, spring had breathed life back into the Oregon coast. Liam and I stood in my garden, under the same oak tree where I had once felt so utterly alone. The divorce was in process, a mountain of paperwork and quiet sorrows, but it was happening. It wasn't the explosive ending I had feared, but a slow, deliberate dismantling of a life that no longer fit. Liam reached for my hand, his touch now familiar and grounding. He had waited, just as he said he would. He had given me the space to find myself, not to choose him. This wasn't the future I had ever envisioned for myself. It was messier, more complicated, and tinged with the sadness of what was lost. But it was real. This life was my own. It was a choice born not of passion or escape, but of the quiet courage to finally be seen. And I was learning that true love wasn't about being saved by someone else. It was about having the strength to save yourself and finding someone who would simply and patiently hold your hand while you did.